You are listening to the Novel Writing Podcast, episode 182. I'm your host, Colleen Mitchell. Grab a cup, cozy up, and let's get to writing. Today I have suspense thriller author JD Barker as my guest. JD has written or co-written 20 books. He writes regularly for Rolling Stone and he hosts the Writers Inc. podcast. I got to see JD at Author Nation last year, where he co-chaired a panel on writing suspense. And I am really excited to have a slice of time with him today. So, JD, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So, can you tell our listeners a little bit more about your background and how you got into the writing world?
Yeah, so I've had a crazy journey. So I was in the corporate world, working a job that I basically hated, like many authors, mainly because my parents told me you can't make a living as a writer. Like I always knew I wanted to write. I would come home and I would write for fun, but they steered me into that corporate gig. But I continued to write for fun on the side. And over 20 some years while I was working in the corporate world, I was a chief compliance officer for a brokerage firm, which is as horrible as it sounds. And then I would come home at night and I would work on writing projects, primarily as a book doctor and a ghostwriter. So helping other people get published. I did a lot of memoirs for some very famous people and just did that for 2 or 3 decades. And over that time frame, I had 6 different books that hit the New York Times list that came out all with other people's names on the cover that I had written, which gets old after a while. So at one point my wife pulled me aside and she said, "Listen, I know you want to become a full-time author. Let's figure out a way to make that happen." And we were kind of trapped because I had a decent salary. So we had a big house, we had cars, we had a boat, and we had the expenses associated with all that. So I couldn't just walk away from the day job. She came up with this crazy plan. We sold everything that we owned. We bought this tiny little duplex in Pittsburgh and rented out one side to some tenants, lived in the other side, and basically lived off of savings long enough for me to kick out that first book. It was crazy.
And did that one got picked up by a traditional?
It actually didn't, and mainly because I had worked in the industry for a very long time, but never on the agent side, so I had no clue how to
Okay.
actually query an agent. So I did it all wrong. I bought a list of agents, literally an Excel spreadsheet with like 200 different agents on there. I sent them all basically a form letter to whom it may be concerned. Here's my book. Here's what it's about. Take it or leave it. Like I didn't look at any of their websites to see what their submission guidelines were. None of that stuff. So surprisingly, I didn't get a whole lot of responses on that. So I ended up going the indie route with it. I got crazy lucky. Stephen King read an advanced copy of it, and he let me use some of his characters from Needful Things, which honestly, that really kicked off my career when librarians and bookstore owners, when they read about that, that really lit up sales, and I ended up moving a lot of copies of that first book. And because of that, I scored a pretty decent deal on my next title in the traditional world because they saw that sales record.
Oh yeah, I mean, if you have Stephen King's name or even James Patterson, who you've co-written with, like that name kind of that says something to people. People are so excited to have James Patterson at Author Nation this year. It's going to be really cool.
I'm the guy who twisted his arm and got him to come.
Oh, that's
Because
awesome.
honestly, like I've been to so many different writer conferences. I was on the board with ITW, working on Thriller Fest for years. And most of these conferences are fantastic at two things. They're great at working with debut authors and helping you get that first book out. And they are fantastic at pushing all those big name authors, the ones that have been around for 20 or 30 years, but they don't really have a whole lot of content for the people that are in the middle, which is essentially the rest of us.
Yeah.
And when I went to Author Nation, like I realized that's really what they've got. They've got, basically what it takes to get from book 2 to book 30, hit those bestseller lists and really make a career out of it. And I've been working with Patterson now for I think 6 or 7 years. We're on book 6 together. And we have just as many conversations on the business side of things as we do on the writing side. And he is still, he's in his late 70s, which is, hard for me to wrap my head around because he acts like a 20-year-old. But like he came out of marketing. Like he was working in marketing when he published that first book. He wrote the Toys R Us theme song to really to really date him.
Did he
But
really?
he did this. Yeah, he did the same. He was no different than the rest of us. He was working that day job and he would come home and he would write at night. And Long Came a Spider was actually a second novel, and that one took off. And he hasn't looked back since. But
Oh, that's
like I think
hilarious.
really think he's gonna fit right in. With Author Nation. Like he
Oh
is a
yeah.
hustler.
Yeah, it's going to be great. My friend Christy, who's an author, she's the one who told me that James was coming as the keynote, and she's like, if they're getting him, who else are they getting?
Oh, so you didn't hear about the other person that I got?
No.
So I have opened up my little black book for Joe Solari and these guys over at Author Nation. I got Jodi Picoult. She's going to be doing a live Zoom event with us.
I'm actually not familiar with her.
She's fantastic. More probably best to Google her, but she
Okay.
she is definitely a hard hitter, really big name in the traditional world.
Okay, okay, that might be why I don't know her because I'm not really paying attention to traditional at the moment.
Yeah, well, to be honest with you, like I've been in both camps. I indie published
Yeah.
that first title and I got a taste of the economics and the freedom that you get. My next couple of books were traditionally published. Then I took a hybrid approach where I told my agent, I'm going to publish in English on my own and you can sell the foreign rights because I'm in about 150 different
Mm,
countries. So I did that for a couple of books, so I've had feet in both camps for a really long time. But even doing that, like I thought that that would solve, the bulk of the problems, but there was always one that nagged at me. And like I couldn't get into certain places. As an indie author, you can't get into Target, you can't get into Costco or Walmart. Airports are
okay.
very difficult. Bookstores can be a problem. So ultimately, about a year and a half ago, I signed a deal with Simon and Schuster. They allowed me to create my own imprint on Simon and Schuster. So I
Wow.
basically have my own publishing house, but my print sales and distribution are handled by Simon and Schuster. So I kind of have the best of both worlds at this point.
And that's what you mean by hybrid, where you keep the rights to one form and then they take the others?
Well, when I say hybrid, I was thinking initially like like Caller's Game is one of the books I put out about 4 or 5 years ago. So I published it in English, so in the US, UK, Australia, places like that. But Random House and the traditional guys put it out in a lot of the foreign territories. So like Germany, Bulgaria, Russia, all these other places where I get published. So when I think hybrid, that's what I think of, like this mishmash of both. But, like I said, the waters are just getting very muddy. I think it's not
Mm,
really traditional and indie publishing anymore. It's just publishing.
yeah.
When you have a book coming out, you just, in my world, I look at that book more as a product and I just try to figure out, what is the best vehicle for me to use to take it out. To give you an example, I've got one. The news just came out today. I wrote do you remember Flatliners, a movie from like
Mm,
1990?
no, I was born a few
You
years
don't look
after
old
that.
enough to remember movies from 1990. So this was a really cool film. It had Kiefer Sutherland, Julia Roberts, Billy Baldwin, Oliver Platt, Kevin Bacon, like all these people back at the beginning of their career, basically before they were household names. And it's about med students who kill each other one at a time, and then they bring each other back to life to try to figure out if there's any type of life after death. It's a really
Oh,
cool story idea, and it stuck with me, over these years. And you flash forward to about 3 years ago, the guy who wrote it, his name is Peter Filardi. He was on one of my film projects. He was writing the screenplay for Dracul, which is a prequel to Dracula that I wrote for Bram Stoker's family. And we got to talking, and I told him I had an idea to revamp the Flatliners franchise. So ultimately, we wrote a novel, which we're shopping as of today to reboot this film franchise. And there's film interest on the backside because obviously it's a proven entity. So it's this weird thing. But so I have choices. Like I have this book
yeah.
that's done. It's based on all this existing IP. So I could indie publish it, I could put it out through Simon and Schuster, or I could go the traditional route. So in this case, we're going to let the traditional publishers bid on it and go that route. Mainly because I think if one of the big publishers picks it up, we're going to get a marketing budget that I probably couldn't put behind it on my own if I were to put it out through Simon and Schuster. So I look at each individual book and try to figure out what is the best way to get this in front of the largest group of people.
So it's kind of like looking at each book as its own product and like how can you shop that product to different people who might want it?
Yeah, because it's easy to get comfortable. If you
Yeah.
indie publish a book, you once you have those pieces in place, like I've got an Excel spreadsheet with every step I have to do to indie publish a book. I think every indie author has that, and that makes it very easy to indie publish every book. But you do run into those problems. You don't get into Costco, you don't get to Target. So like in my mind, like I kind of forget about the positive. Like I kind of push whatever's working aside, and I look at those couple of negatives and try to figure out how to solve those. So I never really get comfortable with any of it. Even with Simon and Schuster, like, that was great. I celebrated that for about 15 minutes. Now I'm looking at what is next, like how do I take this to the next level?
I feel like every time we reach some kind of goal like that, like the next book is published or like a movie deal, like if you have movie deals, like it's that shot of excitement for 10 to 15 minutes and you're like, okay, I have to move on to the next project, the next project, the next project.
Yeah, one of the guys on my podcast, Kevin Tumlinson, you may know him if you've been from Author Nation, but he just put out a post this morning on his Substack, and he's basically talking about that. Like none of us really stop long enough to smell the roses.
Yeah.
We accomplish that goal and we move on to the next. For me personally, like I feel like I'm moving my own goalpost. Like every
Yeah.
time I accomplish something, I try to make it harder on myself instead of taking that couple of minutes to celebrate and enjoy some of the things that we achieve. But yeah, I mean, getting back to that original question, I think indie authors tend to get comfortable, traditional authors tend to get comfortable, and because of that, none of us really try anything new. And meanwhile, the world itself is changing. So if you keep doing the
Yeah.
same thing over and over again in a world that's changing around you, sooner or later it stops working.
That's actually a really good segue into what I wanted to talk about, which was you seem to do things really well with thinking differently as an author. whether it's co-writing with James Patterson of all people to offering a night at a haunted house as a promotion strategy. So, like, what is your process for coming up with unique ideas like this?
Very similar to what I mentioned with Flatliners. So when a book is done, I take a close look at it. I look at what everybody else is doing to promote their titles at that, whatever, any given moment, make a list of those things, and then I try to come up with something completely outside the box. One of the things that I learned a long time ago when it comes to selling literally anything, it could be a cup of water, it could be a car, a boat, or a book. You need to stand out. And in order to actually move stuff, you really need to have word of mouth. Like when it comes to books, you can buy Facebook ads and Amazon ads all day long, but the second you turn that off, then any sales you're getting from that avenue is going to dry up. But word of mouth tends to sell books over and over again, and it tends to be like an exponential thing. It snowballs. So I try to come up with things that are going to get people talking. So the one that you're talking about, I've got a book that came out about 2 weeks ago called Something I Keep Upstairs. It's a haunted house story. The tagline for the book is, for a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die. But the house itself in the book is real. It actually exists. It's a real haunted house on a real private island right off the coast of the island where I live in New England. So I'm giving away an overnight stay to one person in that house. So basically 1 month after publication, so June 13th, we're going to draw the name of one person. They're going to get to pick three of their friends. We're going to put them on a boat, drop them off on the dock on this private island, and tell them, they can stay in that house for 24 hours. We're not going to, nobody's coming back. And, it's a weird proposition because, it is a haunted house. Like we just did the book release party. I had paranormal investigators crawling all over it, and they got tons of EVPs and other things. But, it's just, some people really like that. They want to stay in it. But like when you go on social media, everybody's talking about this, like I'll do it. Will you do it? I'll do it if you do it. I'm not doing it, but they're chatting about it.
Yeah.
And that sells books.
And it did not, it's not lost on me that June 13th is Friday the 13th.
Yeah, yeah, that wasn't an accident.
I figured it wasn't. I figured that was very much on purpose.
Yeah, I mean, we try to think through every possible aspect of it. Like that's something else that people are starting to pick up on. I just noticed in social media maybe about a day or two ago, people started to realize, hey, wait a minute, that's Friday the 13th. Yeah, because now
Yeah.
it's getting close.
Right. So for authors who are new starting out, have maybe they haven't maybe they haven't even published their first one, or maybe they're just a couple books in. When we're thinking about how do we stand out in this crowded marketplace, what can we do as newer authors that doesn't cost as much as booking a private island with a haunted house on it?
Well, you have to just look for something different. So let's go back to the very beginning, my very first book, Forsaken. I had 0 people on my mailing list. This was about 10 years ago. I've been at it for a little over a decade. This book was coming out as an indie title. I published it, and, sales were okay at the beginning, but nothing spectacular. And I had mentioned the Stephen King thing. How that played out is in the story, I had to explain where the wife buys a journal. So just to get the book done, I wrote that she walked into Needful Things, Stephen King's store, and bought it there. Fully expected to have to change that because you can't do that sort
Okay.
of thing without a bunch of lawyers jumping down your throat. But my wife read it and she said, you know what, before you change it, let's try to get King's permission to use it. So next question is, how do you get King's permission to do anything? Turns out he's got a house in Florida that's 10 minutes from my mom's house. So we were down there visiting my mom. We printed out the manuscript. We hopped in the car and figured, well, we'll just head over to Steve's house. We'll catch him outside gardening or something. I'll hand him the manuscript. He'll give us a big thumbs up and we'll be on our way by lunchtime. It didn't play out that way. So King lives on this little island off the coast called KC Key. You go over a tiny little bridge, and if you make a left, you go to the public portion of this island where the hotels and bars and restaurants and stuff are. And if you make a right, you go to like the entire half of this island that he owns. And there's
Wow.
immediately a no trespassing sign. There's a private drive sign. There was a gate. We never actually got to Stephen King's house. We got about halfway down this road. We realized this is probably a really bad idea. We turned around. We went to a restaurant. I called a friend of mine who knew him, a guy named Dallas Mayer. He passed away a few years ago, but he was good friends with King. And he said, listen, yeah, don't stalk Steve. He hates that. Here's his email address. Just send him the book. If he likes it, he'll get back to you. If the book is terrible, he probably won't reply. King replied back and said, I love the book. Go ahead and, use whatever you need. Let me know if I can help in any way, which was
Wow.
fantastic. But, fast forward a little bit, the book came out. I figured, I've got Stephen King's blessing. I've got all this going on. Sales are going to, happen organically.
Mm.
They didn't. The book was there, but discoverability is a problem for everybody. So that's when I took a step back and put my marketing hat on. I reached out to a friend of mine who used to do PR for bands out in California and told her that I needed to generate some buzz for this book. And we just started hashing out different ideas. And I just told her about this failed trip to Stephen King's house, and she stopped me. She's like, you know what? That's the story. So she wrote that up. She wrote up this story about an author who tried to get to Stephen King to get his permission, who never actually got there. And that story came out in Publishers Weekly. And when that story came out, then librarians saw it, bookstore owners saw it, and that's what
Oh,
actually lit up
nice.
the sales. So we basically took something that, happened, could have been a totally forgettable event, and turned it into something that actually ignited my career. So
Yeah.
we constantly look for things like that. And I challenge any author, take a step back. You can find it. You don't have to spend a dime. You just have to be creative.
And as authors, that's what we're good at is being creative. So it's just applying it in a
Exactly.
different way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there anything else that you had on the top of your mind that you wanted to talk about?
No, I mean, I'm thrilled about Author Nation coming up, and we've got some great guests coming up for that. I've been working really close with Patterson, building a model similar to his. I've got a lot of co-authored titles coming out. So this year, when I'm at Author Nation, I'm going to be looking for co-authors.
For what genres?
Pretty much across the board. I mean, the common thread in all my books is suspense. And I've found that as long as I keep that common thread, I can include elements of horror, elements of romance, Western, sci-fi. As long as that suspense thread is there, the readers seem to come along for the ride. So I'm really looking for people that write differently than me. Like I wrote a book about a year ago called Heavy Are the Stones with a woman named Christine Daigle. She's a neuropsychologist in real life, so she was able to bring that skill set into the writing room. And I could fake my way through it just like any author can. I can do some Google searches, watch some Netflix, and I can, pull it off if I have to. But having that genuine voice in the writing room with you is priceless. So I'm constantly looking for that. I'm looking for somebody who can bring something to the table that I can't necessarily do on my own.
So since we have a few minutes left, can you go a little bit more into what it takes to co-author and like how that works?
Yeah, I mean, I came out of a world where I was a book doctor and a ghostwriter. So I was, I spent more of my career working with other people than I actually have writing solo titles. So I collaborate with other people very well. I love mentoring authors, and I did that for a long time. I would find authors and they would pay me a fee, and I would teach them how to write, basically hold their hand through the entire writing process. But honestly, I felt icky about that. I didn't like taking money from people, but I kind of had to do it because it was a gatekeeper. Only the serious people actually did it. So fast forward to today, what I do is I completely flip the model on its head. I find somebody, who's a good writer, who's let's say 80% there. Like I spot something in their writing that I know I can fix. I can help them weed out this particular thing and I can make them better. I bring them in as a co-author and I hold their hand through the whole writing process. We come up with the idea for the book, the tagline, the title, the outline, all based on things that I've learned, that I've learned from Patterson. I basically walk them through that entire writing process from start to finish and teach them how to write, a book that can hit the bestseller list because many authors are very close, but they're missing like this one, this 10%. There's just one little thing missing. And if they don't get that help, they just keep repeating whatever that problem is over and over and over. And their books, might be 4-star reads. They have to be 5-star reads. And I can get them there. So I walk them through all of it. We get the finished book done. I put it out through Simon and Schuster. And I mentioned I'm in 150 different countries. So their name is on the cover of every one of those books, which really opens a lot of doors. So when they get their next book done, if they decide they want to take it into the traditional world, they're going to query an agent is going to query them, and they're going to see, hey, they've already got a sales record in all these different countries. They've got, here's sales records on a book that have already, it's already released. They can see all of that data, and it makes it so much easier for them. So they basically get the experience in that learning curve of working with somebody who can get them to the bestseller status, and they walk away with, something that can help them, continue their career. So it's a win-win for everybody.
How do writers get into that with more established authors like you? I know you probably don't have enough time to take on everybody, but if people are looking to co-author and go down that route where you have the your name on the book across the world kind of thing, where would they start looking?
I've never been afraid to ask the question. So if I'm standing in
Okay.
an elevator with an author that I want to work with, I will ask them. I will bring it up. I won't let that elevator door close and 15 seconds go by and then walk away on me. I would rather have them say no. And what you're going to find, let's say, I like to pick on Lee Child. Lee Child is not Lee Child's real name. His real name is Jim Grant, which is on his Wikipedia page. It's not a secret. But he basically started as every other author does. He wrote a couple of books under his real name. Those didn't work. He wrote some under pen names, and he had a couple different things out there. All of a sudden, these Jack Reacher books took off, and he got stuck writing Jack Reacher books as Lee Child year year after year after year after year, which is great when it comes to your bank account. But from a creative standpoint, who wants to write that same book over and over again? So if you approach somebody, a big name author that's like that, that's kind of stuck in that rut, you can actually give them an out because you could say, hey, I'm so and so. I'd love to write a book with you. That gives them the ability to write something different because now they've
Yeah.
got a book coming out that's got their name and has your name on it, so it's perceived as something different. It can be sold as something different, and it gives them a chance to kind of, stretch their legs a little bit. That's how you open those doors. The very first memoir that I ever wrote, and this was years before I started publishing, I was at a Miami Dolphins football game and I was down on the field and I literally just walked up to a very famous player and we were talking. And I said, hey, have you ever considered writing your memoir, writing a story about your life? And he said, I get approached for that all the time, but I can't write and I don't have the time for it. So ultimately, after about 30 minutes, we came up with an idea. I'd write the book for him. His agent would take it out and we split the money. So like when I see those opportunities, I ask the question.
Yeah. Don't be afraid to ask, is basically what it
Yeah,
comes down to.
yeah. I mean, it's to me, it's much better to hear the word no than it is to not get an answer at all.
Yeah. I mean, if you don't ask, the answer is already no.
Exactly.
So it sounds like people listening, if you want to do this kind of thing, go to an author conference like Author Nation. It's coming up in
Or
November
anywhere else.
or anywhere
Yeah.
else. Yeah. I'm going to a different one in July. So it's called Realm Makers for Christian speculative fiction. So it'd be
Okay.
my next conference other than Author Nation.
Wow. Okay. Have fun.
Yeah, I'm excited for it. So yeah, thank you so much for your time today. It was really great talking with you.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, if listeners want to connect with you or find out more about your 20 books, where can they find you online?
Easiest place to find me is at jdbarker.com. The books are pretty much everywhere. The latest title is something I keep upstairs that released on May 13th.
Awesome. Thank you again.
All right. Thank you.
That is it for today's episode. Thanks for joining us, and remember, the first draft is supposed to be garbage. Thanks for listening to the Novel Writing Podcast. If you're ready to stop struggling and start finishing your novel, check out the 60-Day Novel Writing Challenge. It's a step-by-step program designed for solo writers to complete their first draft with clarity and focus. Visit the link in the description to learn more.